Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and so far in this series we've talked a lot about recent world history and how it all teaches us important lessons to carry forward into our understanding of Ukraine and Russia right now. It would seem like a lot of people took this position before the conflict started, that there was absolutely no way Ukraine would be able to defend themselves against Russia. Most people have a mental framework of Russia being this massive country in the same way that China is, and that Ukraine is just some small stepping stone between Russia and the West. Ukraine is about the size of France, and many parts of it are much more densely populated than your average Russian city. Yes, Russia is a large country, don't get me wrong, even in terms of manpower. Even if we're not talking about equipment, the military advantage that Russia has is quite immense. However, the invasion is a lot more demanding than you might expect, and Ukraine was expected to be able to conscript a lot of citizens in the event of an invasion. In this respect, I think their success has exceeded many outside expectations as well. It's still by no means a fair or easy fight, but at the same time, this was never something that was a foregone conclusion that Ukraine could succeed here, especially with the amount of outside aid they were getting even before the February invasion happened. One of the many interesting ways that this is playing out that we haven't really seen so much in a war scenario before is this meme war that's going on across the internet, right? I really enjoyed the perspective of looking at this as a meme war, at least, because there's a lot of Russian propaganda, and it's 2022, and Ukraine is fighting the most propagandistic culture in the world, right up there with the US and China. Propaganda warfare is going to be one of the battlefields on which this war is fought. And the counter-propaganda here was really easy to make. You don't even have to write Ukrainian propaganda right now. You just have to show what's actually happening in the streets. Because actually seeing what's happening has an incredible effect on the Russians and the Ukrainian people as well. It's like almost no matter what comes out of Ukraine, it's working to the Ukrainian advantage. The sad footage that you get out of this reinforces and breaks down the Russian narrative that they're not targeting civilians, when it's obvious that they are. I find it really interesting to know that, and I'm curious about how effective this will be as a counter to a lot of the Russian propaganda counter-narratives to the Russian citizens. When they're saying a lot of things right now like, well, we're only bombing schools because, radical elements, they're using the schools to hide, right? And they're using these children as human shields. We had to bomb that school. It wasn't because we wanted to attack civilians. It wasn't because we were committing a terrorist act within this war, purely for political intimidation. It wasn't because we were committing war crimes against our brothers. No. But the reason that I don't think that this type of propaganda is necessarily going to fly within Russia is because this is a carbon copy of the US imperialist propaganda. It's a carbon copy of Israeli imperialist propaganda. This is exactly the type of narrative that the Russian state media is happy to call out. Maybe not so much in the case of Israel, but definitely in the case of the United States. So it's very likely that the Russian audience may already know that these talking points are lies because they've already been told by their government, and they already have seen them in the context of Americans saying it over the last few years. And maybe they don't remember this? I don't know. Again, I'm really curious how effective this particular line of counter-propaganda will be, because if there's any people in the world that have been primed to recognize these talking points as absolute bullshit, it's got to be the Russian people. And I think this explains the massive protests that we're seeing, even growing within the Russian borders. You get a lot of sad footage that really encourages soldiers to question why they're in this war, that encourages Russian civilians to question Russian propaganda. But then there's also another category of true Ukrainian propaganda that is just, I've seen so many wild fucking videos. Like, did you see this $16 million tank getting towed by a Ukrainian farmer in his tractor? That was hilarious. I mean, you have these scenes like Tiananmen Square, where you see a column of Russian tanks coming through a Ukrainian city being stopped by thousands of protesters. And they're filming this because they know it's only going to go one of two ways. The story will either be that Russians are being completely shut down by this, or they aggress against these peaceful protesters defending their homeland. It's either going to be a sad story or a triumphant one, and neither makes Russian imperialism look particularly good or even competent. A lot of these soldiers, especially the first wave of soldiers, came in under this impression that they were coming to free the sovereign Russian citizens of the Donbass from an alleged Nazi occupation. Those were the marching orders when they first left and started their campaign for the actual invasion of Ukraine. These people are in the field every day, and these Russian soldiers are realizing that the reasons they were told they had to do this were absolute bullshit. One of the logistical issues is that there's a lot of Russian soldiers who haven't had cell phone service since they entered Ukraine. They don't have access to social media. They don't really have any way of gauging how this is going by use of the internet. So just imagine the surprise when a soldier, walking for hours from a truck out of gas or stuck in the mud, is met with a hostile Ukrainian greeting as he's forced to grovel for them for food and fuel. We've seen this as well in videos that have been majorly embarrassing to this big, tough Russian military. And this whole thing makes me wonder if Vladimir Putin said the Russian equivalent of "you will be greeted as liberators" to the soldiers who first entered Ukraine. Because as you hear about Russian soldiers early on going door to door in Ukrainian villages looking for fuel and food, finding only resistance, they're really acting as though they expect the Ukrainians to be grateful for their actions. And it's almost as if some of these people aren't fully aware that they are the invaders or aggressors in this situation because of how they've been propagandized prior to entering the country. In Ukraine right now, men are not being allowed to leave the country if they are of military age. They're being encouraged to arm themselves and defend their country, defend their cities. And a lot of people have done this. However, I don't necessarily feel good about them not letting some of their citizens out of their country when Russian forces have already been so willing to inflict civilian casualties. At the same time, the Russian army is mostly conscripts too, and we do still have some form of a draft here in the United States, even if we don't use it. So I can't be too mad at Ukraine for doing this, especially since this is probably the most logical and ethical time to do something like that. But at the same time, for the rest of the world, it's far easier to get them weapons and training than bodies on the ground. So the human capital of potential soldiers in Ukraine is incredibly important right now. So yes, it's not the greatest move, but I have been able to confirm that this is happening, and it is critically strategically important here. Now, Ukrainians are arming themselves and taking positions to defend their cities. They may be outnumbered overall, or before the invasion started, their trained military may have been outnumbered. But as long as there are enough bodies to carry them, it seems like every Western country is happy to send them a whole lot of arms. There's a big difference between arming civilians and actually having trained military, and Ukraine will always be outnumbered in this respect. But they might be able to give a similar number of boots on the ground ultimately, especially when you consider how slow and arduous the process has been for Russians to get their equipment inside of Ukrainian borders. It also means that at least in the near term, it's far more likely that Ukrainians will continue to outnumber Russians in most scenarios. That being said, even just saying this, Chernobyl and Kherson have both fallen to Russia already, just over a week into the conflict. Side note about Chernobyl, yes, the radiation levels have increased by a bit, but it's still a long ways lower than anything that anyone really needs to be concerned about. Unless you happen to be a soldier directly occupying that area, but even then it's not a huge concern. But at the same time, if it's a concern to anyone, it will be the people who are directly occupying that area who will be most affected by this. And just like many other elements of this story, one wrong shelling would rapidly change that scenario. But for now, there's not really a huge risk of radiation out of Chernobyl as things stand. Still, this is a fight 8 years in the making. Russia has been threatening these people for over a decade. even poisoning Russia's political competition in Ukraine in 2004. Many Ukrainians feel like Russia is long overdue some comeuppance, and they've been standing at the ready to give it to them. Russia made a mistake in not remembering the passion of the Orange Revolution or the Euromaidan, where protesters fought back against police who had been given orders to kill them by the Russian leadership. The time has come for them finally to stand up, like they did in 1991. And history finds that they are ready and waiting.